Beneath the ancient oak trees of St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina, lie 9 graves that the city's most prominent families refuse to discuss. Each headstone bears the name of a wealthy plantation owner who died between 1851 and 1855, all under mysteriously similar circumstances, sudden paralysis followed by what physicians of the time called merciful death. But in 1923, when the cemetery underwent renovation, groundskeepers made a horrifying discovery that city officials immediately ordered sealed from public record. Inside each of those 9 coffins, the wooden lids bore deep scratch marks from fingernails, and the bodies lay in positions suggesting desperate struggles. What the authorities found next would haunt Charleston's elite for generations. A leather journal buried beneath the cemetery's oldest magnolia tree, written in the careful handwriting of a man named Solomon Fairfax, detailing 4 years of calculated revenge that began with a family's screams and ended with 9 men buried alive. Before we continue with the story of Solomon Fairfax and the dark secret that transformed a gentle healer into Charleston's most methodical killer, we need you to be part of our community of truth seekers. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these buried stories from America's past. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? We love hearing from our audience across the country. The journal's first entry, dated March 15, 1851, began with a single line that would explain everything. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. Charleston in the 1850s stood as the crown jewel of Southern aristocracy, where white-columned mansions lined the Cooper River and fortunes built on rice and cotton created dynasties that believed themselves untouchable. The city's medical community, though small, commanded enormous respect among the wealthy elite who could afford private physicians for their increasingly frequent ailments, mysterious fevers, sudden weakness, and strange paralytic conditions that seemed to plague Charleston's most prominent families with alarming regularity. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway had established his practice on Meeting Street in 1845, quickly earning a reputation among Charleston's upper class for his innovative treatments and unusual understanding of exotic remedies. His success stemmed partly from his exceptional assistant, a slave named Solomon Fairfax, who possessed an almost supernatural knowledge of medicinal plants and chemical compounds. Solomon had been purchased specifically for Dr. Hathaway's practice after demonstrating remarkable skills in botanical medicine, skills that had been passed down through generations of his family who had served as healers on various plantations throughout the Carolina Lowcountry. Solomon Fairfax was not the typical field slave that populated Charleston's plantations. Standing tall with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings, he had been educated alongside the children of his previous master, learning to read and write before such education was strictly forbidden. His knowledge of Latin medical terms impressed even Dr. Hathaway, who had come to rely heavily on Solomon's ability to prepare complex compounds and assist with delicate procedures. The wealthy patients who visited Hathaway's practice grew comfortable with Solomon's presence, often requesting him specifically for his gentle bedside manner and seemingly intuitive understanding of their ailments. But Solomon's life had not always been confined to the sterile walls of a medical practice. For 32 years before coming to Dr. Hathaway, he had lived on the Pemberton plantation 15 miles outside Charleston, where he had married a woman named Celia and raised 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, in one of the plantation's slave quarters. The Pembertons had allowed this arrangement because Solomon's healing skills proved invaluable during the frequent outbreaks of fever and disease that could devastate a plantation's workforce overnight. Solomon's expertise had saved countless lives, both slave and free, earning him a measure of respect unusual for someone in his position. He had developed treatments for everything from snake bites to consumption, using a combination of traditional African remedies passed down from his grandmother and new techniques he learned by carefully observing the white physicians who occasionally visited the plantation. The Pembertons had even allowed him to tend to their own family during times of illness, a privilege that demonstrated the genuine trust they placed in his abilities. However, this relative comfort ended abruptly in March of 1851, when Edmund Pemberton's gambling debts forced him to sell portions of his human property to cover his mounting financial obligations. The sale was to include Solomon's wife and children, who would be separated and sent to different plantations across the state, a common practice that plantation owners justified as business necessity, but which destroyed families as effectively as any natural disaster. Solomon had pleaded with Edmund Pemberton, offering to work additional years without any compensation if his family could remain together. He had even suggested alternative arrangements, perhaps hiring himself out to other plantations during peak seasons to generate additional income. But Pemberton, facing creditors who demanded immediate payment, refused all negotiations. The sale was scheduled for March 14, 1851, at the Charleston slave market, and nothing would change that decision. The morning of March 14th dawned gray and humid, with storm clouds gathering over the Ashley River, as if nature itself sensed the tragedy about to unfold. Solomon had spent the previous night holding his family close in their small cabin, memorizing every detail of their faces, every sound of their breathing, knowing that sunrise would bring permanent separation. Celia, his wife of 15 years, had maintained her composure throughout the ordeal, focusing her energy on preparing their children for what lay ahead. 8-year-old Marcus, the eldest, had inherited Solomon's intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond the plantation. 6-year-old Samuel possessed his father's gentle nature and natural affinity for healing, often helping Solomon gather medicinal plants from the woods surrounding their quarters. Their daughter, 4-year-old Grace, clung to her mother with the instinctive understanding that something terrible was about to happen, though she could not comprehend the full scope of what awaited them. As the slave traders arrived to collect their human cargo, Solomon watched helplessly as his family was loaded into a wagon alongside 6 other families being torn apart by Edmund Pemberton's financial desperation. The children's tears mixed with their parents' desperate promises that they would find each other again, somehow, someday. Promises everyone knew were lies designed to ease unbearable pain. But the true horror began during the journey to Charleston's slave market. Halfway to the city, one of the wagon wheels struck a deep rut in the rain-soaked road, causing the vehicle to tip precariously. In the confusion that followed, Celia fell from the wagon, striking her head against a sharp rock embedded in the roadside. Blood immediately began flowing from the wound, and Solomon, despite his shackled hands, tried desperately to reach her. The slave traders, concerned only with delivering their cargo in sellable condition, made a decision that would haunt Solomon for the rest of his life. Rather than seeking medical attention for Celia, they declared her a loss and ordered the wagon to continue without her. Solomon screamed and fought against his restraints as they left his wife bleeding and unconscious by the roadside, but the other slaves held him back, knowing that resistance would only result in punishment for everyone. The nightmare intensified at the Charleston slave market, where Solomon was forced to watch as his children were sold to separate buyers. Marcus was purchased by a rice planter from Georgetown who specialized in using child labor for the dangerous work of tending irrigation systems in alligator-infested swamps. Samuel was bought by a cotton farmer from the upcountry whose reputation for working slaves to death was well known throughout the region. Grace, too young for field work, was sold to a family in Savannah as a house servant, disappearing forever into the vast network of human bondage that connected southern cities. Through all of this, Solomon maintained an outward appearance of resignation, knowing that any display of emotion or resistance would make his situation even worse. Inside, however, something fundamental had broken. The man who had dedicated his life to healing, to preserving life and easing suffering, watched as everything he loved was destroyed by the casual cruelty of men who viewed human beings as property to be liquidated when convenient. Dr. Hathaway, unaware of the full scope of Solomon's tragedy, purchased him primarily for his medical skills, paying a premium price that reflected Solomon's reputation as an exceptional healer. The doctor had heard about Solomon's abilities from other physicians who had witnessed his work at the Pemberton plantation, and he desperately needed someone with advanced knowledge of medicinal compounds to help with his growing practice. As Solomon was led away from the slave market to begin his new life as Dr. Hathaway's assistant, he cast one final look back at the place where his family had been scattered to the winds. In that moment, something cold and calculating settled into his heart, a patience that would allow him to wait, to learn, and eventually to make those responsible pay a price that matched the enormity of their crimes. That evening, alone in the small room above Dr. Hathaway's practice that would serve as his new quarters, Solomon began writing in a leather journal he had managed to keep hidden throughout the ordeal. His first entry, written by candlelight in the careful script he had learned as a child, began with words that would define the next 4 years of his life. Today I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. But I'm still alive, and I remember every face, every name, every voice that laughed as my world ended. They think they have broken me, but they have only taught me patience. The months following Solomon's arrival at Dr. Hathaway's practice passed in a blur of routine medical procedures and careful observation. Solomon performed his duties with the same quiet competence he had always shown, mixing compounds, preparing treatment rooms, and assisting with patient care. But beneath this facade of acceptance, he was conducting an entirely different kind of study, learning the intimate details of Charleston's medical community and the wealthy families who comprised Dr. Hathaway's clientele. Dr. Hathaway, a widower in his 50s with no children of his own, had come to rely heavily on Solomon's expertise. The doctor suffered from arthritis that made precise work increasingly difficult, and Solomon's steady hands and encyclopedic knowledge of medicinal preparations had become indispensable to the practice. More importantly, for Solomon's developing plans, Dr. Hathaway had begun allowing him to handle certain patient interactions independently, particularly when dealing with chronic conditions that required regular monitoring and treatment. Charleston's wealthy elite, accustomed to the finest medical care available, initially viewed Solomon with the typical mixture of casual indifference and condescending approval that characterized their interactions with skilled slaves. However, his obvious competence and respectful demeanor gradually earned him a level of trust that would prove crucial to his plans. Patients began requesting him specifically, praising his gentle touch and apparent intuitive understanding of their conditions. During this period, Solomon methodically researched the backgrounds of every wealthy family that visited the practice. He learned about their business dealings, their social connections, and most importantly, their involvement in the slave trade that had destroyed his family. Through careful listening and discreet inquiries among other slaves who worked in Charleston's grand houses, he compiled detailed information about the men who had participated in or profited from the auction that scattered his children across the South. His investigation revealed that Edmund Pemberton had been merely one link in a much larger chain of exploitation. The Charleston slave market operated with the support and participation of the city's most respected citizens, men who served on church boards and charitable committees, while simultaneously treating human beings as livestock to be bought and sold for profit. These were the men who attended elegant dinner parties to discuss literature and philosophy, while their wealth was built on the suffering of families like Solomon's. Among Dr. Hathaway's regular patients, Solomon identified 9 men who had direct connections to his family's destruction. Some had been present at the auction, bidding on human cargo with the same detached interest they might show when purchasing horses or cattle. Others had provided financial backing for the slave trading operation, lending money to dealers who specialized in breaking up families to maximize profits. A few had purchased slaves from the same auction that had sold his children, contributing to the system that treated human beings as disposable commodities. As 1851 progressed into 1852, Solomon began experiencing what he privately called his education in advanced chemistry. Dr. Hathaway's medical library contained numerous texts on pharmaceutical compounds, including detailed descriptions of various substances that could produce paralysis, unconsciousness, or the appearance of death, while leaving the victim's mind fully aware. These books, written for legitimate medical purposes, became Solomon's textbooks in a curriculum of revenge. The most significant discovery came in a treatise on South American plant toxins, which described a compound derived from a vine that grew in the Amazon basin, but had been successfully cultivated in the greenhouse of a Charleston botanist who supplied exotic specimens to wealthy collectors. This particular toxin, when properly prepared, could induce a state of complete muscular paralysis while leaving the victim's consciousness and pain sensation entirely intact. The affected person would appear dead to casual observation, but would remain fully aware of their surroundings for several hours before the toxin's effects proved fatal. Solomon spent months learning to identify and cultivate the plant, eventually locating specimens in the greenhouse of Dr. Hathaway's friend, Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw, who taught natural sciences at the College of Charleston. Professor Crenshaw, unaware of Solomon's true interest in botany, was delighted to find someone who shared his passion for exotic plant species and began allowing Solomon to help maintain his greenhouse collection. Through careful experimentation with laboratory mice, Solomon determined the precise dosage needed to achieve the desired effects. Too little would merely cause temporary weakness. Too much would result in immediate death. But the correct amount would create a state indistinguishable from death to anyone lacking extensive medical knowledge, while preserving the victim's consciousness long enough to experience the terror of being buried alive. The psychological preparation for what he planned required perhaps even more discipline than mastering the chemistry involved. Solomon had to maintain his gentle, helpful demeanor while internally preparing himself to watch men suffer in ways that violated everything his healing nature represented. He justified this transformation by regularly reviewing the names of his children in his journal, reminding himself of their fate and the callous indifference of the men who had profited from their sale. As winter approached in 1852, Solomon had identified his first target, Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a wealthy rice planter who had not only attended the auction where Solomon's family was sold, but had loudly joked about the breeding potential of the children being offered for sale. Fitzpatrick suffered from chronic gout and visited Dr. Hathaway's practice monthly for treatments that provided temporary relief from his painful condition. The Colonel's regular appointments, his trust in Solomon's medical abilities, and his habit of arriving alone for his treatments made him an ideal first victim for Solomon's carefully planned campaign of revenge. But Solomon forced himself to wait, knowing that patience and perfect execution would be essential to avoiding suspicion and ensuring that all 9 men received the justice they deserved. In his journal, Solomon wrote detailed profiles of each intended victim, noting their medical conditions, their treatment schedules, and their involvement in the slave trade. These entries read like a physician's case notes, but they documented a very different kind of treatment plan, one designed not to heal, but to ensure that 9 men would experience the same helpless terror that Solomon's children had felt as they were torn from everything they had ever known. The transformation of Solomon Fairfax from healer to methodical killer began with meticulous preparation that spanned the entire year of 1852. Every detail had to be perfect, every contingency planned, every variable controlled. The men he intended to target were not isolated individuals, but pillars of Charleston society, whose deaths would be scrutinized by the city's most prominent physicians and investigated by authorities who would be under intense pressure to find explanations. Solomon's first step involved establishing himself as an indispensable part of Dr. Hathaway's practice. He began arriving earlier each morning to prepare the office, staying later each evening to organize medical supplies, and demonstrating such dedication to his work that Dr. Hathaway increasingly relied on his judgment in medical matters. This growing trust would be essential when Solomon needed to handle certain patients independently without the doctor's direct supervision. The development of his paralytic compound required months of careful refinement. Working in a small shed behind Dr. Hathaway's office, ostensibly to prepare herbal remedies that supplemented the doctor's treatments, Solomon cultivated the toxic vine and experimented with extraction methods. The process was dangerous. Several times he accidentally exposed himself to small amounts of the toxin, experiencing temporary numbness that gave him a terrifying preview of what his victims would endure in their final hours. The compound in its final form was a colorless, odorless liquid that could be easily mixed with other medications without detection. When administered in the correct dosage, it would begin taking effect within 30 minutes, initially causing weakness and disorientation that would be attributed to the patient's existing medical condition. Within an hour, complete paralysis would set in, but the victim would remain conscious and able to hear, see, and feel everything happening around them. Most crucially, the paralysis would be so complete that it would be impossible to detect breathing or pulse without extremely careful examination. To physicians of the 1850s, lacking modern diagnostic equipment, a patient treated with Solomon's compound would appear to have died peacefully from natural causes. Only someone with extensive knowledge of the toxin's properties would recognize the subtle signs that indicated the victim was still alive, but completely immobilized. Solomon's selection of Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick as his first victim was both strategic and personal. Fitzpatrick's monthly visits for gout treatment provided a predictable schedule, and his arrogant demeanor made him particularly easy to despise. More importantly, Fitzpatrick lived alone except for house slaves who were terrified of him, making it unlikely that anyone would insist on an extended wake or detailed examination of his body after death. The Colonel's medical history provided Solomon with the perfect cover story. Fitzpatrick suffered not only from gout, but also from a weak heart, a condition that Dr. Hathaway had been monitoring for several years. If Fitzpatrick died suddenly, heart failure would be the obvious diagnosis, requiring no further investigation or autopsy. On December 15, 1852, Colonel Fitzpatrick arrived for his regular appointment, complaining that his gout pain had worsened significantly over the past week. Dr. Hathaway was attending to another patient, so he instructed Solomon to prepare Fitzpatrick's usual treatment and begin the consultation. This routine delegation of responsibility provided exactly the opportunity Solomon had been waiting for. As Solomon prepared the Colonel's medication, he added precisely measured drops of his paralytic compound to the solution. Years of medical practice had taught him to maintain steady hands and a calm expression, even in stressful situations. Skills that served him well as he crossed the line from healer to killer. Fitzpatrick, accustomed to receiving treatments from Solomon, consumed the medication without question or hesitation. The conversation that followed would be burned into Solomon's memory forever. As the toxin began taking effect and Fitzpatrick started feeling weak, Solomon sat beside the Colonel's chair and spoke in the same gentle tone he had always used with patience. "Colonel Fitzpatrick," Solomon said quietly, "I want you to know that my name is Solomon Fairfax, and you destroyed my family at the slave auction on March 14, 1851. You laughed when my children were sold. You joked about their value as breeding stock. Do you remember that day?" Fitzpatrick's eyes, already glazing over from the advancing paralysis, showed a flicker of recognition and then growing horror as he realized what was happening. He tried to speak, to call for help, but found that his voice had been stolen along with his ability to move. Solomon continued speaking in that same calm, professional tone. "You're not dying yet, Colonel. The medicine I gave you has paralyzed every muscle in your body, but your mind is completely clear. You can hear every word I'm saying. You can feel everything that's happening to you. In about an hour, Dr. Hathaway will examine you and pronounce you dead from heart failure. Your body will be prepared for burial, and tomorrow evening you'll be placed in your coffin and buried in St. Michael's Cemetery." Solomon leaned closer, ensuring that Fitzpatrick could see his face clearly. "But you won't actually die until several hours after you're buried. You'll be completely aware as the dirt is shoveled onto your coffin. You'll hear every sound, feel every sensation, and have plenty of time to think about what you did to my children. That's when you'll understand what terror really feels like. The paralysis was now complete. Fitzpatrick appeared to be a corpse, but Solomon could see the desperate awareness in his eyes, the frantic effort to somehow communicate or escape his immobilized body. Solomon checked the colonel's pulse and breathing with professional thoroughness, confirming that both were so faint as to be undetectable without specialized instruments. When Dr. Hathaway entered the treatment room 5 minutes later, he found Solomon standing respectfully beside what appeared to be Colonel Fitzpatrick's body, his expression showing appropriate concern and sadness. "I'm afraid the colonel has passed, Doctor," Solomon reported quietly. His heart gave out while I was preparing his next treatment. He seemed to go very peacefully. Dr. Hathaway's examination confirmed Solomon's diagnosis. The colonel showed no signs of life, and given his known heart condition, the cause of death seemed obvious. Within an hour, the body was removed to Fitzpatrick's mansion, where arrangements were made for a funeral, befitting one of Charleston's most prominent citizens. Solomon attended the funeral, standing respectfully in the section designated for slaves, while Colonel Fitzpatrick's coffin was lowered into the ground. As the first shovelfuls of dirt struck the wooden lid, Solomon wondered if Fitzpatrick was still conscious, still aware of what was happening to him. The thought brought him no satisfaction, only a cold sense of justice finally being served. That evening, Solomon made the second entry in his journal. "Colonel Fitzpatrick has paid for his crimes. 8 more remain. Justice is patient, but it is also certain." The months following Colonel Fitzpatrick's burial passed with agonizing slowness as Solomon waited to see if his method had aroused any suspicion. Charleston's social circles buzzed with the expected condolences and remembrances of the colonel's contributions to the community, but no questions were raised about the circumstances of his death. Dr. Hathaway mentioned the case to other physicians as an example of how quickly heart failure could claim even seemingly healthy individuals, and Solomon's reputation as a skilled and caring medical assistant remained untarnished. This successful execution of his first revenge gave Solomon confidence to proceed with the second phase of his plan. But it also forced him to confront the psychological toll of what he was doing. Despite years of careful preparation and absolute certainty about the justice of his cause, actually watching a man die in terror had affected him more deeply than expected. He found himself unable to sleep for weeks afterward, not from guilt, but from the vivid imagination of what Fitzpatrick had experienced in those final hours buried alive. The selection of his second victim required careful consideration of timing and method. Solomon needed to avoid establishing any pattern that might eventually attract attention, which meant varying both the intervals between deaths and the apparent causes. His research had identified Judge Marcus Calverton as an ideal second target, a man who had not only witnessed the sale of Solomon's family, but had provided legal justification for the separation of slave families, arguing in court that such practices were essential for maintaining order and maximizing economic efficiency. Judge Calverton suffered from severe migraines that had grown progressively worse over the past 2 years, forcing him to seek treatment from Dr. Hathaway on an increasingly frequent basis. The judge's condition provided Solomon with both opportunity and cover. Migraine sufferers were known to occasionally suffer fatal strokes, and Calverton's advanced age made such an outcome medically plausible. But before Solomon could implement his plan against Judge Calverton, an unexpected complication arose that nearly derailed his entire campaign of revenge. In March of 1853, Dr. Hathaway announced that he was considering taking on a junior partner, a young physician named Dr. Timothy Henderson, who had recently completed his medical training in Philadelphia and was eager to establish himself in Charleston's competitive medical community. Dr. Henderson's addition to the practice would mean increased scrutiny of Solomon's activities, more witnesses to his interactions with patients, and greater difficulty in administering his paralytic compound without detection. Even more concerning, Dr. Henderson had trained under physicians who were familiar with the latest advances in forensic medicine, including techniques for detecting unusual substances in deceased patients. Solomon realized that he would need to accelerate his timeline significantly. Rather than spacing his victims' deaths over several years as originally planned, he would need to complete his mission within months, before Dr. Henderson's presence made continued operations impossible. This compression of his schedule would require him to take greater risks and accept less than perfect conditions for some of his planned murders. The pressure to move quickly led Solomon to his first serious mistake. While preparing for Judge Calverton's treatment in April 1853, Solomon accidentally used a slightly higher dose of his paralytic compound than intended. The judge's apparent death occurred more rapidly than expected, and the intensity of the paralysis was so complete that even Dr. Hathaway noticed something unusual about the body's condition. "Strange," Dr. Hathaway murmured as he examined Judge Calverton's corpse. "The muscle rigidity seems more pronounced than typical for stroke victims. And look at his eyes. There's something almost desperate about their expression." Solomon's heart raced as he watched Dr. Hathaway conduct a more thorough examination than he had performed on Colonel Fitzpatrick. For several terrifying minutes, Solomon feared that his entire plan was about to be exposed. But Dr. Hathaway's medical training, while thorough for its time, lacked the specific knowledge needed to recognize the effects of Solomon's exotic toxin. After 15 minutes of examination, the doctor concluded that the unusual symptoms were simply the result of Judge Calverton's particularly severe stroke. "Poor man must have suffered terribly in his final moments," Dr. Hathaway observed, unknowingly describing exactly what Judge Calverton was experiencing at that very moment, paralyzed but conscious as his body was prepared for burial. Judge Calverton's funeral was attended by even more prominent citizens than Colonel Fitzpatrick's, as befitted a man who had served Charleston's legal community for over 30 years. Solomon watched from the slaves section as the judge's coffin was lowered into St. Michael's Cemetery, just 3 rows away from where Colonel Fitzpatrick lay buried. As the funeral concluded, Solomon noticed something that sent a chill through his blood. A young man standing near the back of the crowd, taking careful notes in a small leather book. The note-taker was Thomas Grimsby, a journalist for the Charleston Mercury, who had begun investigating what he privately called the prominent deaths phenomenon, a series of sudden fatalities among the city's elite that seemed statistically unlikely. Grimsby had noticed that over the past 6 months, Charleston had lost several wealthy citizens to unexpected medical emergencies, all under circumstances that were medically explainable but collectively suspicious. Solomon's journal entry for that evening reflected his growing awareness that time was running out. "Judge Calverton has joined Colonel Fitzpatrick in experiencing true justice. But I fear that others are beginning to notice patterns that could threaten the completion of my mission. I must work faster, even if it means accepting greater risks." The acceleration of Solomon's timeline meant that his third victim would need to be eliminated within weeks rather than months. He selected Captain William Dandridge, a ship owner who had transported slaves from Charleston to markets throughout the South, and who had personally supervised the loading of human cargo with the same attention to detail he showed when handling valuable cotton shipments. Captain Dandridge presented unique challenges as a target. Unlike the previous victims who had visited Dr. Hathaway's office regularly for chronic conditions, Dandridge was generally healthy and only sought medical attention for minor injuries sustained during his maritime activities. Solomon would need to create an opportunity rather than waiting for one to occur naturally. The solution came through Solomon's network of contacts among Charleston's slave community. Kitchen slaves who worked in the grand houses along the Battery often gathered information about their master's activities and shared it with slaves from other households. Through these informal intelligence networks, Solomon learned that Captain Dandridge was planning a dinner party for prominent members of Charleston's shipping community, scheduled for May 20th, 1853. The dinner party would provide Solomon with the perfect opportunity to eliminate his third victim while simultaneously gathering intelligence about potential future targets. Kitchen staff for such events were often borrowed from other households, and Solomon had established friendships with